Kirstie Skates, joining us on the stage, is a linguist and a global expert in linguistics, and she's been doing a really interesting piece of work studying the language in wealth management. So looking at things like blogs, websites, what is the sort of language that's used and what message is it telling us? I cannot wait to hear this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Over to you, Kirstie.
Thanks very much. I have to say, after coming up after that engaging and inspiring conversation, I hope I'm not going to bring the energy down too much now by talking about the language of tax. So just bear with me before we go to lunch. So I was asked by the Good Ancestor movement to look at how the private client industry talks about tax. When I say talk, I mean in the broadest sense, thinks about, communicates, what sort of language is used when putting forward the type of tax services, ideas around tax to their clients. So we're going to take today a sort of a whistle-stop tour, really, through the research, looking at a very familiar discourse. So looking at, as I said, how trusted advisors talk to their clients, present the services that they offer. And we're really looking at two different things here. One is, what broad narratives do we see? So what are the different ways in which tax and tax services are presented? And then the second one was, how is that framed? So how are those narratives laid out? Do we see them, are they positive, neutral, negative? So what overall framing are we seeing? And by laying this out, now that's the intention of this research, the intention is to show what has become normal. So we know in any industry, any organisation, any group, in fact, any movement, there's language that becomes the way that we just talk about things. If you come from outside that, when you first join a new organisation, when you first engage with a new community, you often notice that there are different ways of thinking, talking, speaking. They're a little bit different, might even seem a bit odd. But once you're in that, you can't see it anymore. And the thing is that over time, that tends to crystallise. So the language that's used about particular issues to frame or construct particular ideas in the world, it gets crystallised and it just sort of sticks like that. And the problem for industries is that over time, society, customers, clients, expectations move on, and you can get stuck with a particular set of language and the ideas that it suggests. So what we're going to do is look at that today and then see what that might mean in terms of opening up different ways of talking about tax and tax services, and therefore potentially different ways of thinking about them. So very briefly on the approach, for this particular piece of work, we predominantly use discourse analysis, which is a qualitative technique, but looks at quite large amounts of language data, often spoken, written, formal, informal language. In this instance, we were just looking at written language, and says, what language patterns can we see? So across all of this data, either sort of strong or faint patterns. What can we see, not just in terms of the themes of how people, what people are saying, but how they're talking about it. So sorts of things that we might look at when we're doing work with organisational culture as pronouns. When people say we, who is we? Is that we the organisation, we the management, we just our little team? Who's they? So it can be incredibly telling. Other things that we look at, absences, for example. What as an outsider might we expect to hear people talking about, but we're just not hearing them say it at all. So we're looking at these types of patterns, and from those patterns, we're then looking at what that might mean in terms of the worldview that's being projected or the frames of reference that are being drawn on. Okay, so just very briefly in terms of what we looked at. We looked at the language used by 100 firms in the private client industry, so you can see the types of firms we looked at. And we were particularly looking at those that offered services to wealthy people. So not tax planning services to someone who's just thinking about, should I have an ISA or not? And we sampled a set of those. And we were looking at the language that was used on their websites, in blogs, articles, talking specifically about tax and tax planning. So we needed to keep it quite narrow. And you might think, well, this is not really showing the interaction. This is not like sitting in a room with an advisor and a client who are talking. But what we do tend to find is that this type of formal public language can give you a window into the sorts of conversations, the sorts of language that's used internally. So those types of things tend to leak out onto the public field. Okay, so I'm not going to go through these, but essentially there are a whole set of different language patterns that we could see that sort of started to emerge from the data. And critically, they all centered around a single dominant narrative. So when we were looking at whether tax was positively or negatively framed, or neutrally framed, it became very, very clear that there's a very strong normalized narrative which sits in this negative frame. We're going to run through this, but in summary, a sense that, and these are all actual quotes from websites, no one likes to pay tax on their hard-earned money. Interesting, the point about hard-earned money. Tax landscape's never been more complex. We're here to help you navigate through it, safeguarding your money from the effects of tax, minimizing the amount of tax you'll pay, and critically keeping it away from HMRC and the taxman. There was another, probably the closest to neutral we saw was around being compliant. We will help you be compliant. You know, we will make sure that anything that you do is compliant. Sometimes that was just a statement, very neutral. Sometimes that was drawn into this dominant narrative. Now, the interesting thing about this narrative is that in almost all other industries and discourses that we look at, you expect to see a fracturing of narratives. So you might see a dominant narrative, but you might also see emergent, new, fresh narratives, so different ways that different parts of that community or industry are talking. Here, surprisingly, it all just sat in this one sort of clump of language. Alternative narratives, so some of the sorts of things, I mean, I even had to say to the Good Ancestor movement, well, what would it look like? So I'm thinking maybe I just don't know what I'm looking for. So things around what tax is for, contribution to society, responsibilities as a citizen, values around tax, none of those things were visible. In 100 sites, thousands of lines around tax, there was one example of actively positive language around tax, which actually came from Switzerland in a blog, and it was sort of an anecdote about a client. So that's what we found. Tax is overwhelmingly framed in negative terms. So we have an unavoidable certainty. Everyone loves the Mark Twain quote, also attributed to various other people. But interestingly, it can also be avoided. So we see on the other side, it is something that you can minimize, mitigate, or in the case of inheritance tax, avoid altogether. Make sure it's of no concern to you. We also see it talked about in moral terms. So everybody, of course, everybody has to pay their fair share of tax, but then we see it constructed as an obstacle, a burden, a threat, taxes that can eat into your wealth, huge burden, don't get stitched up. So there's this sort of overwhelmingly negative framing that we see. Even phrases like unavoidable certainty that you might think are perhaps neutral. I went digging. I was interested in this, so I went digging, looked at on Web Corp, it's a web corpus, where you can just put in a term and see how it's used in everyday language. So you can see what types of contexts is that phrase used. As you can see here, drainage, cemeteries, death, failing, transphobia. I mean, not good things. So even these seemingly neutral terms are not so neutral in themselves. Okay, tax is a highly challenging environment. Sorry, the tax system, highly challenging. We can see here, again and again, complexity, increasingly punitive, continually changing. Some combination of all of those three was pretty much the way that any tax planning sort of section of texts was set up. This is the way that you set up the issue. Within that environment, you have advisory firms who are there to help navigate the client through it. Now, this was one of those areas where there was a very, very strong language pattern that comes out. This was nothing sort of faint that we had to go digging for. Two things, really. One was this strong metaphor cluster of the tax landscape being a place of potentially hidden danger, disorientation. We see that in metaphors of maze, minefield, pitfalls, all of these sorts of things. But also linked to that, the advisor being there to help navigate through it. So this phrase, this sort of navigation metaphor, was used again and again and again and again by so many different advisory firms. So it's essentially, it is literally the trusted guide who's there to help take the client through this very complex, punishing landscape. And it's interesting because that language implicitly sets up a relationship between the advisor and the client, which is of the advisor leading the way. So whether that's intentional or not, the way that it's linguistically constructed is like that, because we know that if one party in a relationship has a particular strongly constructed role, it only leaves a certain number of other roles for the other party. We'll come on to that a little bit more later. Thing that was very notable in this complexity is that actually the terms that are used to describe the services are very, very simple. Everyday words: planning, efficiency, structures. And we know that these are very simple words that are used to describe very complex, complicated things. They also seem like very neutral words. Tax planning could simply mean, have you set up an ISA? Are you using your pension in the right sort of way? Or it can mean a whole set of other things. So there's essentially this sort of code. I've got a colleague who talks about some of these sorts of terms as swamp words. The idea that they sort of seem solid on the surface, but you don't really know what sits underneath them. You see it in regulated industries, things like advice. Advice doesn't just mean like, oh, I'm going to give you the benefit of my advice. It means something very, very specific. Same as goodwill with complaints. As a gesture of goodwill, we'll give this to you. That means something very specific. Okay, so a very notable dominant narrative was this, what I ended up calling this three-part mantra. There are different variations of this, and we've heard some of the previous speakers talk about this. Grow, preserve, distribute. Protect, maintain, enhance. Preserve, administer, enhance. We just saw it again and again, the idea that there's a very well-established, probably historically established, way of managing wealth. And you need to grow it, look after it, and pass it on. And across all of those stages, you need to protect it. You need to protect it from tax, because it could potentially be taxed at any of those stages. And it becomes very clear that firms align themselves with this purpose. We see people talking about our passion, our aim, our main aim. That's what we're here to do. And as part of that, it's a given that the advisor's role is to minimize the amount of tax that's paid. Now, I thought before going into this, I thought that this, again, might be something that was euphemized, or we might have to sort of dig under the surface to find this. But actually, it's very explicit that, through sort of unhedged declarative language, very explicit that the role of the private client advisor is to minimize the amount of tax paid. We see minimising losses to tax, minimising your tax burden, avoiding inheritance tax. So there's this strong, uncontested assumption that, that the client wants to pay the minimum amount of tax. There's also a role in this language constructed for the client. And of course, we don't see, this is not a dialogue, so we don't see what the client's saying. We simply see this space being created for them. And here there's a right way for the client to behave. And I don't mean right in terms of getting your taxes right, so being sort of accurate in what you submit to HMRC. I mean a sort of almost moral evaluative position. So we see a set of norms being emphasised. And some of this, sorry, 1 more minute, okay. I'm definitely not going to finish in 1 minute. Sorry, okay. So there's evaluative language where things are sensible, responsible, the right thing to do. It gives you a sort of priceless sense of well-being. Everybody wants to avoid tax. Nobody wants to pay it. You know, it's the normal thing to do. And wealthy clients, in particular, are at risk. So there's more to gain, but also much more to lose as a wealthy client. So there's a sense that this is an important responsibility. Right, I'm moving through now. Clients are regularly reminded about responsibilities to loved ones. We saw a lot of reference to loved ones. And loved ones are nearly always set up in opposition to the taxman. So do you want to protect your loved ones, or do you want to let the taxman be your largest beneficiary? And this is a very strong opposition that's set up, unlike in some other areas, for example, impact investing, where there is at least some discussion about contribution to society, contribution to others. Within tax, there's no discussion of that at all, and there's a lot of emotive language in this. You know, burdens, insensitivity of this tax. Finally, in terms of the language patterns, wealth itself, I started noticing that linguistically it becomes separate from people. Sometimes it's not your wealth or their wealth, it's just wealth. And sometimes wealth is something that is passive, it needs to be protected, or it's just transmitted across generations. And other times it has agency of its own, it can protect others. You know, and we know that that's a strong role that wealth plays, is in terms of protecting the family. So this, as I said, this narrative is very strongly held in place. It's held in place by a set of oppositions that are set up. So things like your family versus HMRC, doing the right thing versus being irresponsible. And it's also set up because it's a norm, a sort of sense that this is the only right and moral way to behave. You need to protect tax from the taxman. We're going to help you through this complexity. The responsible thing to do is actually to make sure you minimise the amount of tax you pay, because otherwise, what about your loved ones? Okay, so finally, what does it mean? Well, it means that it's a narrative and a discourse that's very tightly held in place. It's very hard to even imagine or think about how it might be different because it's so firmly held in place. But once you start laying it out like this, and once you make it visible, this very familiar and normal language is something that you can start to question. So seeing it is the first opportunity that you have to start thinking about changing it. And then you can think about things like, is this what we actually intend? Is this what our clients want? Could we have a different type of conversation? And I know these are exactly the type of questions that will be continued to be asked through this afternoon.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you so much.